Hi, my name is Marty. I use they, them pronouns, and tonight I'm going to teach you how to make an artisan bread. So this recipe comes from Sally's Baking Addiction, which is one of my favorite baking websites. A lot of my recipes come from her. This recipe makes a bread that has kind of like a crisp crust, but pretty chewy once you get through that first layer. It has really big air pockets, which I like about it too. Some of the perks of this recipe are that the timing is super flexible, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit too. You can add a lot of flavors. You can add everything from like nuts to fruit to cheese, spices, everything. And it's pretty easy to kind of customize like what recipes and what flavor profiles you want with it even after you bake it as well. This is also a really good recipe for my disabled friends if you have issues with like motor function, or if you kind of lack strength in your arms or in your wrists. It's really easy to kind of put together without using a lot of stress on those areas. So there's a lot to like about it. Alright, so again, first thing we're going to do is wash our hands. I'm going to take off my watch. You're going to get your hands wet. You're going to get yourself some soap. And you're going to lather up for 20 seconds. Again, lots of songs you can use. I've seen people using all sorts of different songs. I don't know how music works on YouTube, so I don't want to sing those songs. Hey, you want to wash your hands too? You can't. You're a cat. You hate it. This is Ruthie. She's the worst. I can talk about her for 20 seconds. She's very cute. I love her a lot. She misbehaves pretty much 24/7. She likes fish and hates rules and peace of any kind. Yeah? Yeah. Alright, it's about 20 seconds. I'm going to rinse our hands off. Rinse, really? Really? Alright. Usually when I make this recipe, I go by weight. Today I'm going to go by mass, which is cups, teaspoons, things like that. Full disclosure, bread scares me a little bit. It's not usually my comfort zone. This is the other cat, Casper. I do like this recipe because it is only 4 ingredients. It is very simple, and you basically put it together and forget about it for a while. So we're going to get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is mix our dry ingredients. So we have flour, we have kosher salt, which we're going to talk about in a second, and we have yeast, which we're going to talk about in a couple seconds after that. First thing, flour. We are going to do 3 1/4 cups. So again, like we talked about last video, we're going to spoon that flour in and kind of shake it out so we get that as close as possible. That's one thing that I like about baking by weight, is that it's a lot harder to kind of get it off in any direction, because you know, a cup of flour can be pretty much anything like that from the top, but weight is weight. That's 1. This will be 2. If you have a hard time remembering how many scoops you've done of something, I like to make like little counting games for myself. That I have one that goes like all the way up to 8 that uses members of my family, like, you know, 1 me, 2 brothers, 3 siblings, 4 with our best friend, things like that. That's 2 brothers. Maybe that's just me, but I think it's easier to count when you're putting a concrete thing to it. So flour is going to be pretty much the main ingredient in anything that you're baking for the most part. That's 3. And then, like I mentioned in my last video, you might need a different measuring cup for a quarter. Mine has the lines on the side, so it's a little easier for me to use the same one. And some of them have that too. Alright, it's 1/4 cup. Alright, so the next thing we're going to add is our salt. And I said we were going to talk about that. This is kosher salt. I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but it's a little coarser. Like, you can even kind of hear that crunch. You can use regular salt, like this kind of salt that you might have at home. If you do use regular salt, I would add like a teaspoon more, because it doesn't necessarily hold as strong of a flavor. So we're going to do 2 teaspoons of this. We're going to sprinkle it right in. And again, 2 teaspoons of kosher salt or coarse salt. You can even use like sea salt. But if you're going to do table salt, I would do 3 teaspoons. Alright, So we're going to add our last dry ingredient, which is yeast. Yeast is really cool. It's really inexpensive, which makes it a great tool to have when you're baking. It usually comes in a strip of 3 packets like this. Each one's about 2 teaspoons, and pretty much looks like this no matter what store you get it from, no matter what brand. They sell it in jars. I like the little packets because it's easier to keep track of, and pretty much it's always going to be somewhere between like $1.50 and $2 tops, and like that, you know, $1.75 range. So we're going to cut one off. You can try and tear it. I don't recommend it. I have struggled. We're going to get all the yeast at the bottom, and then snip off the top. When you open it up, you'll be able to see it's kind of like a tan color, and it's actually alive. I'm going to talk about that more in a sec. But we're going to sprinkle that in there. So now, before we add our water, we're actually going to stir this together so that the salt and the yeast are both kind of incorporated into the flour better. You can use a fork for this. I like to use a whisk because it kind of gets it more in there, more evenly dispersed, but again, fork's fine. I've used a fork before. So we're going to kind of stir that together and really just make sure it's even. And that is because when we add the water, it's going to start coming together as a flour more, or as a dough more. So we want to kind of keep it from all clumping in one area or another. Alright, that is pretty much good. So yeast is pretty cool. Yeast is what helps things rise. So you're going to use it in bread recipes usually. You're going to use it in things like cinnamon rolls. You might use it in some cakes. It depends on the type of cake. I use it to make pizza crust as well, which is why I have so much of it, because I just love pizza. That's another day. But my housemate just mentioned something interesting that I didn't know, which was that the first domesticated animal was not considered an animal, but actually yeast, because it's alive, which is pretty interesting. So the way that yeast works is once you add it to any dough, any mixture, it's going to need a little bit of moisture and a little bit of heat to get it going. I have here water. We're going to need 1.5 cups. This is a cup, so I'm going to have to get some more in a moment. But what you're going to do, come on over. What you're going to do is you're going to make what's called a well, which is kind of like making a little hole in the bottom. You don't want to like have the bottom of the bowl showing, but you want to have just enough. And what that's going to do is make it easier to add the water slowly instead of just kind of getting this big slop going. So this water, usually when you work with yeast, you are going to use water that's kind of like warm a little bit to the touch, like not hot, because if it's too hot, it'll actually kill the yeast. That's why when it starts baking, it doesn't rise too much, because the yeast actually dies. But you don't want it to be too cold or it's not going to do anything. Usually you're going to want your water somewhere in that like warm range. For this recipe, we really want a slow rise. We really want it to kind of take its time. So we're going to use something that's a little more cool than that. So kind of like right below what you would consider warm temperature. So I'm going to pour that right in the middle. I'm going to try and kind of disperse it evenly. Alright, so that is 1 cup. So again, it's kind of tricky to get the temperature right sometimes. I'm going to have to play around with this a little bit. So this is our hot and this is our cold. You know, that's actually pretty close to spot on from the get-go. Man, it's hard being good at everything. A lot of pressure. Alright, and then we're going to start stirring. So if you want to come closer, I can show you how the texture starts to come together. So right now it's just kind of soupy. We're going to mix it up. And this is where this recipe is really good for folks who might need something that's a little lower impact on their wrists and hands, that you don't need to be particularly steady with it. You don't need to use a lot of strength because it's a pretty loose dough. Slack is usually the word for that. So this dough is actually going to come out pretty wet. And if you've made bread before, you're probably going to be tempted to do something called kneading with it. And what kneading is basically when you take your hands and you get like really in there and you're like twisting it around, you're like kind of punching it down, you're like really getting in there. And that's good for most breads. This one we don't actually want to mess with too much. I'm telling you, one of my favorite breads. It requires so little effort. And you are going to need to get your hands in there a little bit. Your hands are going to get messy, but that's okay. The best things in life are messy. And yeah, again, if I were going to knead it, I'd get like really in there. I'm just kind of going to squish it together just a little bit so we get all that flour in there. So it's going to be kind of shaggy and it's going to be kind of sticky. And even if you've like played with dough before, not necessarily made bread, you might think that you did something wrong because it's not completely sticking to itself. Nope, that's just how it's supposed to be. See, oop, even my hand, I'm going in for kneading. That's that muscle memory. But no, we really just want it to be kind of sticking to itself a little bit. So yeah, like you can even see, like that's pretty sticky. It's pretty wet and sticking my hands a little bit. And normally you don't want that when you're making bread. This one, it is totally fine. Alright, so what you're going to do now is get it into a nice little ball. You're going to plop it right in the bottom of the same bowl that you used. Same bowl. And I'll tell you why. Because the next thing we're going to do is cover it up and let it rise. And what it's going to do as it's rising is it's going to cling to these things on the wall of the bowl. It's going to cling to those pieces of flour so it has something to kind of climb with. And that's the yeast working as well. So if you give me 1 sec, I'm going to wash my hands and we're going to talk about it a little more. So we're going to cover it up with saran wrap. You want to get a really good seal because that's how you're going to keep any air from getting in or out. That yeast really needs just a little bit of warmth to keep it growing. So like I'm going to use 2 pieces because I have a little gap right there. Yeah, again with kneading it, it's kind of something you just got to be able to feel out as far as like the texture of the dough. I've made this bread quite a few times now, so I kind of know what it needs. You might have to make it more than once before it comes out how you like it and how you want it, which is a hard truth for me because I really like to be good at things right away, but life doesn't work like that. So what you're going to do now is you're going to leave this at room temperature somewhere, so either right here on my counter, which is probably what I'm going to do, on your table, on a shelf, anywhere that your cats can't get into it. But you're going to leave it somewhere where it's going to be at room temperature, and you're going to leave it there for about 2 to 3 hours. 2 to 3 hours is ideal. Honestly, this bread is so not picky in any way. I have forgotten it on the counter overnight, and it turned out fine. So it's really up to interpretation, but at least 2 to 3 hours. Then what you're going to do is you're going to put it in the fridge, and that's because, again, like I mentioned earlier, we want a really slow rise, that we don't want it to blow up and have like a couple big bubbles. We really want it to kind of take its time so that we get those nice like pockets inside as well, and that really beautiful structure that you look for when you're making bread. So after that, once it's in the fridge, you can pretty much bake it in like 2 hours. You can bake it in 3 days. I made one of these the other day that I was worried wasn't going to come out well because it had been in the fridge for longer than I've left it in the past, like I think right about 3 days, and it turned out pretty good. So this bread, the timing is super, super flexible, but I'm going to leave it on the counter, room temperature, about 3 hours, and then I'm going to move it to the fridge, and then I'll see you in the morning. So welcome back, new day. We have our dough from last night that we actually are struggling on the fridge space a little bit, but it was cold enough that I could leave it on the porch. So I can show you how it puffed up a little bit. That it was actually even higher when I put it out there, that it was kind of further up here. It's normal for it to sink a little bit as it gets colder. That's okay, that's good. So we are actually first going to wash our hands, which I already did. Then you are going to put some flour on your hands. So if you want to come on over to the makeshift workstation, we're going to put a little bit of flour on our hands, bring it right in there. Make sure that they're nice and dusty. And we're going to grab this dough and break it into 2 pieces. And you want to kind of do that, so if you want to get a better look, you want to kind of do that without knocking the air out as much as you can. So you can see how I'm just kind of like pushing down the sides just a little bit, so that I can hopefully, yeah, perfect how it's peeling off like that. So I can just kind of hopefully get it in as close to one chunk as I can. Because what we're going to do next, we want to try and really not knock too much air out. So yeah, oh, and you can see those nice air pockets in there too. Perfect. No, I'm even going to put a little more flour on my hands. Yeah, we wanted it wet before. This time we want to be able to touch it without tearing it too much. Alright, so this is our dough. We're going to cut this in half. We're going to make 2 sort of loaves. So you can either use like a dough cutter if you have one. I have one, but I kind of just like to do it by hand. So they don't have to be perfect. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use some cornmeal. You can use flour. It works exactly the same way. But I'm going to use some cornmeal and dust our pan. So I'm just going to sprinkle it on. And again, you can do the exact same thing with flour. It's kind of hard to use too much. I like cornmeal because it gives a little bit of a crunch. The reason I'm putting the cornmeal down is because number 1, it's going to keep it from sticking to the paper too bad. And number 2, it's going to add a nice little bit of texture on the bottom and keep it from burning. So again, we're just going to really get in there with it. And like I mentioned in my last video, you can put pretty much anything under it you want. I like to use parchment paper for bread because I think that it gives it a little bit more even baking. So I'm going to go back to my 2 loaves of dough, and I'm going to do the same thing with both. I'm going to take a little more flour in my hands, and I'm going to kind of just give it like a little bit of dryness on the outside. And then I'm going to form a 9-inch by 3-inch loaf. Doesn't have to be perfect. You can make this pretty much any shape you want. I like that size and that thickness because I think it bakes pretty well. So you can kind of see I'm not like touching it too much. I'm just kind of letting like gravity do that work for me and kind of pulling it down because it's still pretty slack. So I'm going to form that the shape I want. That's about 9 by 3. That's close enough to 9 by 3. I'm going to put that on there. So again, it's going to rest right on top of that cornmeal, and it's going to give it a nice crunch. And flour will do pretty much the exact same thing. I'm going to do the same thing with the other one. So again, a little more flour. And you want to try and like not get too many folds in, because where you have that flour, it's not going to make one even kind of seam. It's going to end up having that crack when it's done baking, which is fine if you like it like that. I kind of like those sometimes. I think it adds a nice little pocket for whatever you end up eating it with. But if you want it more smooth, you want to try and really get it even. Alright, so when we put those down, you can notice even with this guy a little bit that he's starting to relax a little more. They're going to spread, and that's okay because we're going to shape them back up in a little bit. But now what we need to do is first get stuff out of the way a little bit. Then we are actually going to cover these again, and we're going to let them rise for 40 minutes. And while they are rising, we're going to preheat the oven. We're going to preheat the oven to 475 degrees. We're going to go all the way up there. That's like pretty darn hot. That's 100 degrees hotter than when we made cookies last week. So 475 degrees. We're going to cover these loosely because when we covered them in the bowl, they had enough space to kind of rise within the bowl. This time, we don't really want to like push them down in any way. We want to give them a little bit of space to expand. And I'm not being as intense about the edges as I was with the bowl. That's on purpose. While that is all happening, so we've got the oven preheating. We're going to put those for 40 minutes. I'm going to hit the timer. This is the most fascinating part, is just setting the timer. We're going to take, this is optional, but we're going to take a metal cake pan. So like 9 by 13 metal cake pan. You don't want to use glass, I'll tell you in a moment. We're going to put this on the bottom rack in the oven. So I've actually moved my bottom rack a little lower. Normally it's in the middle. I'm going to slide that in right in there. So now we've got that pan in there. I'll explain that in a bit. We have the loaves loosely covered so they can rise a little bit more. 40 minutes on the timer for those to rise. Oven's preheating, and I will see you in 40 minutes. Alright, it's been about 40 minutes. Once you get down to the last few minutes of that time, what you want to do is start boiling some water. About 3 to 4 cups. You can do it in a kettle, you can do it in a pan. Doesn't really matter. What you're going to do next is take that plastic wrap off, and you can see those kind of expanded more. That we got a nice little bit of volume on them. Just in there. A nice little bit of volume on them. They did go a little flat, like I mentioned, so we're going to reform them. And I'm just going to get my hands in there. And again, you want to wash your hands anytime you come back to this. I did a few moments ago. Anytime you're touching anything, you want to wash your hands. But yeah, you can see again, I'm trying not to touch it like too much because I don't really want to get too much of the air knocked out. Next thing I'm going to do, right before I put these in, I'm going to do what's called scoring them. So I'm going to take a pair of scissors. These are clean. I clean them down with soap and water. You can use a knife too. I like scissors because it's a little more even. And I'm going to make 3 cuts in each one. I'm going to go about a 1/2 inch deep. And what that's going to do is as they're baking, it's going to leave room for some steam to escape from the inside so that, you know, we don't end up with like either a huge split in the bread or kind of undercooked inside and burnt on the outside. That'll make it so it heats more evenly. So I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3. And I'm telling you, there are very few things in life that are more satisfying than cutting bread. 3. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. This bread is so not picky. And yeah, there we go. So, the reason we put the metal pan in the bottom is because it is going to help us to create a crust on the outside of our bread. It's going to help us make a nice crunch to the outside of it. What we are going to do with that water that we boiled is right before we put the pan in, we are going to pour that in there. The reason I'm not doing this as I'm telling you is because you're going to have to move kind of quickly once you get going. But we're going to pour that water into that hot pan. That pan right now is 475 degrees. The water is just about boiling temperature, which is 212. So that temperature difference, when it hits, is going to create this huge wave of steam. Which then, as soon as we get that steam, we're going to put the bread in and we're going to shut the door really quickly so it's trapped in. And that steam is really going to come around, and that moisture combining with the flour on the outside is going to create that nice crisp crunch. The reason you don't want to use glass, you always want to use metal for that, is because the temperature difference with the water and with the pan can actually make the glass crack. That it can make it either crack a little bit or crack a lot of it, which is not great. So when you're doing this, it's also kind of easy to get a steam burn. Steam can actually burn you because of the heat coming off of it. So you're going to want to put an oven mitt on to pour the water in. I'm even going to take my nice longer one because I do not like to get burned. I will complain for the next 8 years. So you want to be ready to like go because you're going to move kind of quickly. First thing, if you have a pot, just grab it. If you have a kettle, open it up. We're going to open the oven, and you can either pour the water through the rack on top if you want. I'm actually going to pull this out a little bit. I'm not going to touch it too much because, again, 475, that is like wicked hot. So to recap, I'm going to take this, pour the water in there, push it, grab the pan, put it in, shut the door. Let's go. So yeah, you can see that huge wave of steam. And I just felt that like all up to my elbow. So I'm going to put a generous amount in. That is going. Put that in. Push that in. Push that in even further. Slide that in. Close the oven, and we're good. We're going to do 20 to 25 minutes depending on about, you know your oven the best. So if your oven's usually really hot, you can do 20. You can start at 20, go up. I know that mine's about 24 for this recipe. We're going to put 24 minutes on the timer. About halfway through, I'm going to take that pan out and I'm going to rotate it. Because ovens have cold spots, ovens have warm spots, I know that my cold spot is right here and my warm spot is right here. So if I leave it in there the whole time, the bread's going to end up kind of uneven. That whatever's over here isn't going to bake as well, and whatever's up there is going to get burnt. So again, about halfway through, I'm just going to take the pan out and turn it. And when I do that, I'm going to kind of move pretty quickly too, so that I don't let too much steam out. And we'll see you then. Alright, so our timer just went off. We are going to pull it out. When you take the bread out, you want to lean back just a little bit, so you don't get like a face full of steam when it comes out. Yeah, so you can even see that coming out. And then, oh, it's beautiful. Look at that. Oh my god, it's phenomenal. Oh, I love it. Alright. Yeah, that came out pretty good. So we're going to let it sit for a minute and cool a little bit because, again, as long as it's on the sheet, it's still baking. Still 475 degrees in there. One way that you can tell if it is done pretty reliably is if you pick it up and if you knock on the bottom like that and it makes like kind of a hollow sound, that means it's ready. So that still needs to sit for a couple minutes. That if I really want it to be like really crisp, I could even probably put it back in for like 2 minutes in the oven. Alright, so it is just about cool enough to cut into. I'm going to use a serrated knife so it doesn't squish. Just cut down, and yes, so you can see those are those air pockets that built up when we let that rise for a long time. That's why we don't have like huge pockets or like a too close. Those are those nice little air pockets right there. You can see that that texture is going to be really, really beautiful. So, now that our bread is done, you can eat this about 1,000,005 ways. It tastes pretty good with a lot of different flavor profiles, some of my favorites. Sometimes for breakfast I like to slice it up and toast little pieces of it, like maybe that thick, and put like some ricotta and cinnamon on it. There's some nuts in there if I have them too. I like to take some olive oil in a bowl and put some herbs in it, a little bit of garlic, and heat that up and dip it with that. It's really good with soups. Honestly, it's pretty good by itself too. So, now that your bread is done, you can grab yourself a slice, put whatever you would like on it, grab a bite, and that is how you make a loaf of bread.